The fourth physician left on a Tuesday, and the Duke of Carrick stood at the window of the morning room, watching the man's carriage pull away down the gravel drive with the particular stillness of a man who has run out of plans. Behind him, Mrs. Ord set a cup of tea on the sideboard and said nothing. She had said nothing after the second physician, and the third, and the governess who lasted 19 days before questioning her wages and a reference. There was nothing to say. The child was not ill. Every man of medicine who examined her confirmed it. Her lungs were sound, her throat unobstructed, her hearing precise. She responded to questions with nods or small shakes of her head. She ate what was placed before her. She dressed when Nance laid out her clothes. She sat in the nursery with her hands folded, and her dark eyes tracking every movement in the room with an intelligence that made the physicians uncomfortable because it meant they could not call it affliction. Elspeth Haldane, 6 years old, daughter of the late George Haldane and his wife Mary, simply would not speak. 8 months. 8 months since the carriage accident on the Harrogate Road. A wheel split on a frozen rut. The horses panicked, and by the time the nearest farm sent men with lanterns, George and Mary were both beyond help. Elspeth had been at Carrick Hall with her nursemaid. She had been told the next morning, in the library, by her uncle. Miles remembered the exact chair she had been sitting in, her feet not reaching the floor. He remembered telling her plainly because George had always believed children deserved plain speech. He remembered the way she had looked at him, not with confusion, not with the theatrical grief he had steeled himself against, but with a kind of assessment, as though she were measuring whether this particular piece of information would fit inside her body. She had not spoken since. Miles turned from the window. "Has Nance taken her for a walk?" "She has, Your Grace, down to the pond and back." The child went willingly enough. "Did she?" "No, Your Grace," he nodded. He had stopped finishing that question weeks ago, and Mrs. Ord had stopped waiting for him to finish it. The answer was always the same. Miles Haldane was not a cold man, though London would have been forgiven for thinking so. He was a man of systems. His estates ran precisely because he understood delegation, the right steward for the tenants, the right solicitor for the entailments, the right secretary for the correspondence that accumulated on his desk like snowfall. When his brother died, he had applied the same logic to grief. Manage what can be managed, contain what cannot, and do not allow either to interfere with function. He had arranged the funeral, settled the debts George had left, modest but real, transferred Elspeth's care to Carrick Hall, and hired the best nursemaid he could find. Then he had returned to his study and continued. It had not occurred to him, in those early weeks, that the child's silence was anything other than shock. Children were resilient. Everyone said so. She would come around. When she did not come around after a month, he engaged a physician. When the physician accomplished nothing, he engaged another. The governess had been Howell's suggestion. A woman of reputation and patience, and her departure after less than 3 weeks had shaken something in Miles that he did not care to examine. He had begun to understand that Elspeth's silence was not a problem to be solved by finding the correct professional. It was something else entirely, and he did not know what to do with something else entirely. It was Howell who first raised the matter of marriage. Not directly. Howell never raised anything directly, but through the careful arrangement of facts. The estate required a mistress. The household had operated without one since Miles's mother died 4 years ago, and Mrs. Ord, capable as she was, could not attend the social obligations that a duchess would manage. There was the matter of an heir. There was the matter of the child. "The child has a nursemaid," Miles had said. "She does, Your Grace. Nance is devoted, but a nursemaid is not." Howell had paused, selecting his word with the precision of a man choosing a stone from a riverbed. A nursemaid is not a presence, in the way a household requires. Miles had understood him. A nursemaid fed and dressed and walked a child. A wife, a woman, provided something that could not be requisitioned. The match was arranged through practical channels. Ruth Pryor was 26, the daughter of the late Reverend Edmund Pryor of Laholme. A living so modest that the parsonage roof had leaked for the last 3 years of his tenure and been repaired only after his death by the parish as a matter of embarrassment rather than charity. Her mother, widowed when Ruth was 15, had lived another 6 years on a small annuity and the quiet, unyielding care of her only daughter. Mrs. Pryor had died 14 months before Miles's solicitor made his inquiry. Ruth came with no fortune, no connections of consequence, and no illusions. The solicitor had been transparent. The Duke required a wife of steady temperament and modest expectations. There was a child in the household, his late brother's daughter, who needed attention. Ruth had listened to these terms in the parlor of her aunt's house in Whitby, where she had been living since her mother's death, occupying as little space as possible and mending linens that did not need mending because she could not bear to sit idle. She had accepted within the week. The wedding was held at the chapel in Carrick Village on a gray morning in late September. 14 people attended. Miles spoke his vows clearly and without hesitation. Ruth spoke hers the same way. They returned to the hall in separate carriages because his had been waiting and hers had been an afterthought, arranged late by Howell, and neither of them remarked on this, though Mrs. Ord noted it and set a second warming pan in the Duchess's chamber without being asked. Ruth arrived at Carrick Hall and did what she had always done in unfamiliar rooms. She learned them. She walked the corridors until she knew which floorboards sounded and which were silent. She learned Mrs. Ord's rhythms, Cook's schedule, the shape of her husband's days. He rose early, breakfasted in the study, rode the estate with Howell, and retired to the library each evening, where he read until the candles guttered. He was courteous and entirely absent. He inquired after her comfort with the same attentiveness he showed the condition of the stables, genuine but categorical. She was a system that had been installed and appeared to be functioning, and so he moved on. She did not mind this. She had not expected otherwise. What she had not expected was the child. Ruth first saw Elspeth on her second morning. Nance was leading her down the nursery stairs, a small girl in a blue wool dress with dark hair braided back and boots polished to a high shine. Elspeth walked with her hand in Nance's and her mouth closed, and something about the quality of her silence, not vacant, not sullen, but held, like a breath drawn in and never released, made Ruth stop on the landing. She did not go to her. She did not introduce herself. She stood on the landing with her hand on the banister and watched them descend, and when Elspeth glanced up, one brief, measuring look, Ruth met her gaze and then looked away, as one does with a creature one does not wish to frighten. It was perhaps the only correct thing anyone had done with the child in 8 months, though Ruth did not think of it in those terms. Her mother's illness had not been dramatic. Ellen Pryor had simply retreated, slowly, the way a tide goes out, each day a little less present, a little more occupied by something interior and unreachable. Ruth had learned in those years the discipline of proximity without intrusion. She had learned that presence, real presence, was not a thing you performed. It was a thing you sustained quietly until the other person decided it was safe. She applied none of this consciously to Elspeth. She simply lived in the house, and the house contained the child, and Ruth did not avoid the rooms where Elspeth sat any more than she sought them out. Nance noticed. She mentioned it to Mrs. Ord one evening in the housekeeper's sitting room over tea. She doesn't fuss over her. No, said Mrs. Ord. Everyone fusses over her. The physicians fussed, the governess fussed, even His Grace, when he remembers to visit the nursery, which is not often. Fusses, in his way. He stands in the doorway and looks at her as though she is a clock that has stopped and he cannot find the mechanism. And the Duchess? She passed the nursery yesterday while I was brushing Elspeth's hair. She looked in, saw us, said good evening to me, and walked on. Elspeth watched her go. Nance paused. She watched her go so for a long time. Mrs. Ord set down her teacup. Good, she said. 3 weeks after Ruth's arrival, the evenings changed. It was not a decision. It was simply what Ruth did. In Lahome, in the years of her mother's decline, the evenings had been the hardest, long and formless, the parsonage silent except for the clock and her mother's breathing and the occasional crack of the fire settling. Ruth had begun singing the way one begins any habit born of necessity, without ceremony, without audience, simply because the silence had weight and her voice could carry some of it. Her mother had sung, in the kitchen, in the garden, tuneless and constant, the way some women hum while they work. When the illness pulled her so far inward that speech became effortful and rare, Ruth had taken up the habit without thinking, the same songs, old ones. Hymns her father had liked, folk melodies passed from her mother's mother, and before that, from someone whose name no one remembered. She sang them quietly, in the evenings, and the sound filled the space the way candlelight fills a room, not by overwhelming the dark, but by making it habitable. At Carrick Hall, she did the same. The small sitting room adjacent to the nursery had become hers by default, too modest for formal use, too far from the library to interest Miles. She sat there in the evenings with her mending or her thoughts, and she sang. She did not know that the nursery shared a wall. Or rather, she knew it architecturally, but she did not think of it, because she was not singing to anyone. She was singing to the room, to the quiet, because her mother had sung and her mother was dead, and this was what remained. The song that evening was one her mother had called The Thorn and the Bower. Ruth did not know if it had a real name or if her mother had invented one. It was slow and in a minor key, and it concerned a woman who planted a garden that would not bloom until after she was gone. Ruth's voice was not remarkable, a clear, steady mezzo, slightly husky at the bottom of its range, but it had the quality of a voice that has never performed. Unself-conscious, unhurried, intimate in the way that a voice is intimate when it believes it is alone. She reached the second verse, the one about the frost. From beyond the wall, through the plaster and the lath and the heavy nursery door that Nance always left ajar because Elspeth did not like it closed, a voice spoke. One word, again. Ruth's hands went still in her lap. She did not move. She did not call out or go to the door or do any of the things that instinct demanded, because instinct in this case was wrong, and somewhere in the years of sitting beside her mother, she had learned to recognize the moments when the worst thing you could do was respond to a miracle as though it were one. She drew a breath. She began the verse again. In the corridor outside, Miles Haldane stood with his hand on the doorframe of the sitting room and did not breathe. He had been walking from the library to his chambers. A routine passage. He made it every evening at the same hour, his footsteps so regular that Mrs. Ord set the hall candles by them. He had heard the singing first, faint, unfamiliar, coming from a room he had forgotten existed, and had paused out of simple curiosity, the way one pauses at an unexpected sound. He had been standing there perhaps 30 seconds, listening without intention, when the child's voice came through the wall, one word. In a voice he had not heard in 8 months, a voice he had begun, in the darkest part of himself, to believe he might never hear again. He could not move. His hand was on the oak frame, and his mind was 8 months in the past, in the library, telling a child that her parents were dead and watching her fold the information into herself like a letter pressed into an envelope. He had managed. He had delegated. He had treated her silence as a malfunction and hired professionals to repair it. And it had not once occurred to him that what the child needed was not expertise but presence. Not someone trying to reach her, but someone who was simply there, filling the silence with something warm and undemanding and continuous. The way Ruth was there. The way Ruth had been there since she arrived, not inserting herself, not performing care, not making the child a project, just existing in the same house with the same steadiness, and the same quiet, and the same evident familiarity with grief that Miles, standing in the corridor with his chest constricting, recognized for the first time as something he shared with her and had never once acknowledged. His brother's face came to him then. George, who had been everything Miles was not, easy, generous, loud in his affections. George, who was dead and whose daughter had stopped speaking and whose brother had responded by hiring physicians. Miles closed his eyes. The singing continued, faint, steady, a voice that expected nothing. He removed his hand from the doorframe. He walked to his chambers. He sat on the edge of his bed in the dark for a very long time. The next morning at breakfast he looked at his wife, actually looked at her. Not the categorical glance of a man confirming that a system was functioning, but the deliberate attention of a man seeing someone for the first time. She was eating toast with the methodical care of a woman who had learned, in a house with very little, to waste nothing. Her dress was gray, the same gray she had worn 3 days running, and he realized with a lurch of shame that he did not know whether this was because she preferred it or because she did not have another. "I heard you singing last night," he said. Her knife paused. She looked at him with the expression he was beginning to understand was her version of assessment, steady, unhurried, giving nothing until she understood what was being asked. "I hope it did not disturb you. It did not disturb me." He set down his coffee. Elspeth spoke. Ruth was very still. "Yes, you heard her. I heard her. What did she say?" she said again. The word landed between them on the breakfast table, like a stone dropped into still water. Miles looked at his plate. He could feel something pressing behind his sternum, something that had been sealed there for 8 months, longer perhaps, sealed since the night Howell brought the news from Harrogate, and Miles had gone to his study and closed the door and sat in the dark and not wept, because weeping would not bring his brother back, and what could not be fixed could only be contained. I did not know what to do with her, he said. His voice was quiet. I have not known since the beginning. Ruth set down her knife. No one does, she said. That is not a failing. It is the nature of grief. It does not respond to competence. He looked at her. This woman he had married for practical reasons, whose history he knew only as a series of facts. Clergyman's daughter, mother deceased, modest circumstances, and who had, in 3 weeks of near-invisible habitation, accomplished what 4 physicians and a governess could not by trying, by being. Will you sing again tonight? He asked. I sing every evening, she said. I have done since I arrived. He nodded. He returned to his breakfast. But his coffee had gone cold, and he did not ring for more, because he was afraid that if he spoke again, he would say something he was not yet ready to say. Ruth sang that evening and the next and the one after that. She did not change what she sang or how she sang it. She understood that the moment you turned a private act into a deliberate one, you teaching as teacher. The child had not responded to a performance. He had responded to something real. Elspeth spoke again on the 4th evening, 2 words this time, that one. Ruth was halfway through a melody she had no name for, something her mother had hummed while kneading bread, and the child's voice came through. The wall with the same quality as before, not tentative, not fragile, but precise, as though she had considered which words to spend and chosen carefully. Ruth continued singing that one. On the 6th evening, Nance found the nursery door open wider than she had left it, pushed from inside, and Elspeth sitting on the floor beside the wall, her ear against the plaster. Nance told Mrs. Ord. Mrs. Ord told no one, but she ensured the fire in the sitting room was laid properly every evening, and the candles replaced before they guttered. It was Miles who changed next. He began, without announcing it, to visit the nursery, not with the stiff formality of before, but briefly, quietly, in the late afternoons when Elspeth was drawing or looking at picture books with Nance. He sat in the chair by the window and read his correspondence, or pretended to, and allowed himself to be in the room. The first time, Elspeth watched him with her dark, assessing eyes for several minutes, then returned to her drawing. The second time, she barely glanced up. The third time, she brought him a drawing, placed it on his knee without a word, and went back to her table. It was a house. A simple house with a pointed roof and 2 windows and smoke coming from the chimney. Not the parsonage she had lived in with George and Mary, not Carrick Hall, but the kind of house a child draws when she is drawing the idea of home. The essential thing, stripped to what matters. Walls, roof, warmth. Miles looked at it for a long time. Then he folded it carefully and placed it inside his coat. And when Howell asked him later that afternoon about the surveyor's report on the eastern boundary, Miles answered, normally, but his hand went to his chest once, briefly, touching the pocket where the drawing lay. Ruth saw this from the corridor, passing on her way to speak with Cook, and said nothing, but something shifted in her expression, a softening so slight that only someone who had spent years reading faces would have caught it. She had married a man she believed to be decent and remote. She was beginning to understand that he was decent and afraid. These were not the same thing, and the difference mattered. The weeks moved. October thinned into November, and the trees on the estate dropped their leaves and the mornings grew sharp with frost. Elspeth's words increased, slowly, unevenly, in the way that real recovery moves. She spoke to Nance first, single requests, milk, the blue one, not that. She spoke to Mrs. Ord once, in the kitchen, when Mrs. Ord was supervising the preparation of a beef broth, and Elspeth, who had been brought down by Nance for a change of scene, pointed to the carrots and said, Mama put parsley in hers. Mrs. Ord set down her spoon and answered steadily, Then we shall put parsley in ours, and turned away to the window for a moment before continuing. She spoke to Ruth on a Tuesday afternoon in the sitting room. Ruth was mending a tear in one of Elspeth's pinafores. Nance had brought it down, apologetically, and Ruth had taken it without comment. When the door opened and Elspeth stood in the frame in her stockinged feet, holding a small wooden horse that had lost one of its painted ears. Can you mend this too? She asked. Ruth looked at the horse. She looked at the child. I can try, she said. Sit with me and hold the thread. Elspeth sat beside her on the settee. Their shoulders did not touch. Ruth worked on the horse with a patience that was not performance. She had mended 100 broken things in the parsonage at Layholm, and her hands knew the work. And Elspeth held the thread and watched, and after a while she said, You sing the song about the garden. Yes, my mama sang a song about a bird. Ruth's needle stopped for one beat of her heart, then it continued. Did she said, and her voice was as steady as it had ever been, and if her eyes were bright, she did not let the child see. It had a red breast. The bird, a robin, yes. Elspeth considered the wooden horse. She sang it at night. Mothers do that, Ruth said. Do you know it? I might. Will you tell me how it starts? Elspeth hummed 3 notes. They were slightly off-key and entirely recognizable, an old folk song, one Ruth's own father had known, one that existed in 100 variations across the northern counties, and belonged to no one and everyone. Ruth picked up the melody and sang it softly, and Elspeth leaned against her arm, and the weight of the child against her sleeve was so slight and so heavy that Ruth had to breathe very carefully for a moment before she could continue. Miles did not speak to Elspeth until November's end. He had been present, reliably, quietly present, in the way Ruth had taught him by example, but he had not pushed because he was learning, late and imperfectly, that some doors opened only from the inside. It happened in the library. Elspeth had begun venturing beyond the nursery with increasing confidence, and on this particular afternoon she had followed the sound of a clock she liked, the long case in the main hall, and from there wandered into the library where Miles was reading. He looked up. She stood in the doorway, considering him. You may come in, he said. She came in. She walked directly to the shelf nearest the fire, examined 3 titles by running her finger along their spines, and pulled out a volume of engravings, birds as it happened, and sat down on the rug with it open across her knees. Your father liked that book, said before he could stop himself. Elspeth looked up. I know, she said. He showed me the heron. Miles nodded. His throat was very tight. Page 43, he said. She turned to page 43. The heron stood in gray ink on cream paper, its neck curved, its eye patient. Elspeth traced its outline with one finger. Uncle Miles, she said, and it was the first time she had called him by name, any name, since the morning in the library 8 months ago when he had told her that her world had ended. Yes? Can I take this to show Ruth? He could not answer immediately. He pressed his thumb against the arm of his chair until the leather creaked. Yes, he said. She would like that very much. Elspeth took the book and left, and Miles sat in the library with the fire crackling and his hand over his eyes. And for the first time since the night Howell brought the news from Harrogate, he wept. Not with restraint. He wept the way his brother would have wept, openly, with the graceless honesty of a man who has finally stopped managing his grief and allowed it to be what it is. Mrs. Ord, passing the library door, heard him. She continued walking. She found Ruth in the kitchen garden, wrapping the last of the rosemary against frost, and stood beside her for a moment without speaking. The child took a book to show you, Mrs. Ord said. From the library. Yes, I have it. A book of birds. Mrs. Ord nodded. She looked at the rosemary. She looked at the gray November sky. He is in the library, she said carefully. He may not wish to be disturbed. Or he may. She searched Mrs. Ord's face and found there what she needed, not instruction, but permission to trust what she already understood. She set down the twine and went inside. She found him in the chair by the fire. His eyes were red. She did not rush to him. She did not exclaim or soothe or offer comfort in the way that comfort is usually offered, eagerly, invasively, with the implicit demand that the sufferer perform gratitude for it. She sat in the chair opposite his. She folded her hands in her lap. She was there the way she had been there in the sitting room when she sang. Not for him, not performing presence, but present nonetheless, steady and warm and undemanding. After a long time, he said, I should have done better by her. You kept her safe. You kept her fed and warm and in a house that loved her. That is not nothing. I hired physicians. You did what you knew. It was not enough. No, Ruth said, because she did not believe in false comfort, and he deserved better than lies. It was not enough, but you are here now, and so is she, and the rest is what comes next. He looked at her across the small distance between their chairs, and for the second time he saw her. Not the practical wife, not the system installed to manage a gap in his household. A woman who had buried both her parents, and who sang in the evenings not because she was sentimental, but because she understood, in her body and her bones, that some silences could only be answered by continuing to make sound. I do not deserve your patience, he said. Perhaps not, she said, and the corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, the first he had seen from her. But I have a great deal of it, and it costs me nothing to share. Christmas came. It was quiet. No guests, no society, no obligations beyond the estate and the chapel in the village. Mrs. Ord decorated the hall with greenery, and Howell procured a goose of indecent, size, and Nance dressed Elspeth in a white frock with a crimson sash that had been Mary's, found in a trunk that Miles had not been able to open until Ruth suggested gently that the child might like to have something of her mother's for the day. Elspeth sang at Christmas dinner, not a performance. She simply joined in when Ruth began a carol, her small voice threading through Ruth's steadier one. Miles sat at the head of his table and listened and did not try to contain what he felt, and Nance wept into her napkin, and Mrs. Ord refilled everyone's glasses with a briskness that fooled no one. After dinner, in the drawing room, with Elspeth asleep on the settee under a wool blanket and the fire banking low, Miles took Ruth's hand. It was the first time he had touched her with intention, not the mechanical offering of his arm, not the brush of fingers passing a dish, but a deliberate act, his hand reaching for hers and closing around it. "I should like to be a better husband to you," he said. "I do not know how to begin. You have already begun," she said. "You are here. You are not in the library with the door closed. That is the beginning." He looked at their joined hands. George would have known what to do, with her, with all of it. He would have gathered her up on the first day and carried her everywhere and talked to her until she talked back. "George was George," Ruth said. "You are you. She does not need you to be George. She needs you to be her uncle who sits in the nursery and reads his letters and knows which page the heron is on." He tightened his hand around hers. Outside, the first snow of the season was falling on the parkland, soft and silent, covering the paths. By spring, the household had changed in ways that could not be measured but could be felt. Elspeth spoke freely, to Nance, to Mrs. Ord, to Cook, who had become an unlikely ally after Elspeth expressed a fascination with pastry. She spoke to Ruth daily, with the particular directness of a child who has chosen someone and committed wholly. She spoke to Miles with increasing ease, though her conversations with him had a different quality, careful, considered, as though she understood that this man communicated best in short exchanges, and she was willing to meet him there. Miles had Ruth's gray dress replaced. He did it badly, through Mrs. Ord and the village dressmaker, and 3 New Day dresses arrived in the muted, practical colors Ruth preferred. She wore them without comment, but she touched the fabric of the first one, a soft sage wool with the expression of a woman who has not had a new garment made for her in a very long time. He sat in the sitting room in the evenings now. Not every evening. Some nights Ruth preferred solitude, and he was learning to read this, but often enough that it became a pattern. She sang. He read. Sometimes Elspeth was there, drowsy and warm, wedged between them on the settee with a picture book open on her lap. Sometimes it was just the two of them, and the singing, and the fire, and the particular quality of silence that exists between people who have learned that silence does not have to mean absence. In June, on a warm evening with the windows open, Miles brought a small framed sketch into the sitting room and set it on the mantelpiece. George and Mary, drawn in pencil by a traveling artist at a fair 3 years before the accident. George was laughing. Mary was looking at him with the expression of a woman who found her husband ridiculous and adored him for it. Elspeth saw it the next morning. She stood on her toes to look at it, and then she looked at Miles, and then she said, "Papa's nose is wrong." "It is," Miles agreed. "The artist made it too straight. Your father's nose went decidedly to the left, because you hit him with a cricket bat. That is a scandalous accusation. He's 9 years old, and it was an accident. Papa said you aimed." "Your father," Miles said, "was a notorious exaggerator, and I will defend my honor in this matter to my grave." Elspeth laughed. It was a short, startled sound, as though it had escaped before she could catch it, and she put her hand over her mouth afterward, but it was unmistakable. Ruth, standing in the doorway with a cup of tea she had come to deliver, met Miles's eyes over the child's head, and what passed between them was not spoken and did not need to be. Years later, 4, 5, more, the house was so thoroughly altered that visitors remarked upon it. The nursery was no longer a nursery but Elspeth's room, decorated according to her own increasingly emphatic tastes, which ran to botanical illustrations and an unreasonable number of books about birds. Nance remained, not as nursemaid now, but as companion, though Elspeth, at 10, would have said she did not need one, and Nance would have agreed and stayed anyway. Miles and Ruth's son was born in the 2nd year, a boy named George for his uncle, who arrived with his mother's steady temperament and his father's serious brow, and who was, from his first hours, the particular project of his cousin Elspeth, who began reading to him before he could hold his head up. The sketch of George and Mary stayed on the mantelpiece. Other pictures joined it: Elspeth's drawings, a miniature of Ruth's mother, a formal portrait of young George at 2, already frowning with concentration. The room filled with evidence. Not of grief erased, it was never erased, but of grief made habitable, given room to exist alongside everything else. On an evening in late summer, with the windows open and the children asleep upstairs, George in his crib, Elspeth in her room with a candle she was not supposed to have, and a book she had been told to finish in the morning, Miles sat in the sitting room and listened to his wife sing. The same songs, always the same some songs, passed from her mother's mother, and before that from someone no one remembered. He reached across and touched her wrist, lightly, and she stopped singing and looked at him. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" He considered the question. For the child. For the song. For the fact that she had come into his house expecting nothing and had, by the simple act of being holy herself, unlocked every door he had sealed shut. For singing, he said. She turned her hand over so that his fingers rested in her palm. She closed her hand around his. She resumed the song, the one about the garden that would not bloom until after the woman was gone, and her voice was quiet and steady and entirely unself-conscious, and the sound carried through the wall where it had always carried, into the room where Elspeth lay reading past her bedtime, and down the corridor where Mrs. Ord was making her final rounds, and out through the open window into the garden where the rosemary Ruth had, wrapped against frost 4 years ago, was now a sprawl fragrant hedge that scented the whole south side of the house in summer. Candle guttered, Ruth sang. The house, which had been so silent for so long, held the sound the way a cupped hand holds water, gently, carefully, knowing it will slip through eventually, but holding it all the same. They arrive here, like a song heard through a wall, whenever they are ready.